If you were a Loyalist in colonial New England, there was a chance that you were going to have some swamp Yankees come knocking at your door, tar and feather you, raid your house and then burn it down, and potentially drag you here to what's now known as Old Newgate Prison, which was probably just called Newgate Prison back then. In which case, your life actually just got even worse, because this place has been described by its residents as a hellish nightmare, and by the tour guide here as a Darwinian free-for-all. In 1705, copper was discovered here, and the Simsbury mine began in 1707. The mine was created by digging a 80-foot vertical shaft straight down, and then another shaft was dug at 23 degrees following the copper vein, before turning around with branches sprouting off of that main tunnel. For about 50 years, it was mined for ore. At that time, though, smelting wasn't allowed in the British colonies, which meant that all of the ore came out directly and was sent back to Britain for smelting, which was extremely cost-intensive, which meant the margins were razor-thin and that the mine wasn't going to make much money throughout its time. Local workers and farmers from the nearby areas were employed as labor in the mines, and additionally African and Native American slaves were used, leased from their masters or forced to work in the mine. Only 3 to 5% of the material that came out of the mine yielded pure copper, and it wasn't enough to offset the cost of running the mine. Just like moonshiners, many mine owners defied the smelting restriction, constructed furnaces of their own, broke down the ore, and refined it in secrecy. But even that was too much of a financial burden to create enough of a profit for the mining venture to be worth it. The Connecticut government was looking for a new place for a prison in 1773, and the mine was offered up as an idea due to the fact that it had only one entrance, was essentially escape-proof, and was a labyrinth of caves and shafts, making it ideal to hold convicts. A blockhouse was constructed over the main shaft, and a ladder was sent down. It was the only entrance and exit from the mine, besides a shaft used as a well. Prison's first inmate in 1773 was John Hinson, who was sentenced to 10 years for committing a burglary. 18 days later, during a snowstorm, a female accomplice of his braved the snow with a 100-foot rope and sent it down the 80-foot well shaft, allowing Hinson to climb out. The Connecticut government recommended a number of changes, with 2 guards being sent to watch the prison at night, and the ventilating shaft in which Hinson made his escape was also to be covered with a stone, as well as with a strong iron gate 6 feet below the surface. At the same time, they decided that prisoners were to be used as forced labor in order to continue extracting ore. Following the Battle of Lexington and Concord, suspicion of Loyalist sympathies grew stronger, and eventually, the Tories, as they were called, if they weren't assaulted in the street or in their own homes, were thrown in prison around the colonies. Due to the fact that they were not considered prisoners of war, they could not be pardoned, exchanged, or released, and were often sentenced to whipping, imprisonment, and even death. More vocal Loyalists were removed from society, and a good place to put them was in a mine cavern below the earth. Only 5 or 6 Loyalist prisoners were incarcerated in the beginning for numerous offenses, but eventually upwards of 30 to 40 were imprisoned at a time, solely for the act of being sympathetic to king and crown. Once you got here, you were sent down a 40-foot shaft into the caverns below. There were bunks and pallets set up which you were shackled to for 12 hours a day. The other 12 hours you were working up in the prison yard. You were given a small pile of musty straw as your only comfort, and the cave stays at about 50 to 55 degrees year-round. It's often damp, and it was completely dark the entire time you were down there, with no facilities to support anything. Teenage boys were bunked the same as hardened criminals, and in the caverns they faced no natural light. They had no chance of washing, no toilet facilities. Things such as eating, bathing, and going to the bathroom were a lot more difficult for the residents. There was a latrine for prison guards and officials, but for the prisoners, one of the overseer's reports states that a single prisoner was tasked with the job of removing excrementitious matter from the site, probably using a bucket. The guards complained of the struggle to keep prisoners clean, because most of them arrived dirty as is. Prisoners' clothes were washed once a week in strong lye in order to kill vermin. Prisoners were primarily fed beef, pork, bread, potatoes, beans, peas, and cider, and oftentimes they were forced to eat their food at their workstations during the day. Fresh food was expensive, especially at such a rural location. Following several successful escapes, in 1774 the General Assembly of Connecticut instructed that a house be built over the original mine shaft in order to prevent further escapes. In 1777, prisoners attempting to escape via the mine shaft burned the guardhouse down, resulting in the prison closing until 1780. In 1781, 28 men, mostly Loyalists, managed to escape through the original mine shaft when the wife of one of the prisoners was being let down to visit him. Again in 1782, the guardhouse was burned down and the prison remained closed until 1790. In 1806, a group of approximately 30 prisoners used the workshop to melt down pewter from their buttons and turn into keys, after which they were able to unlock the chains holding them, and the insurrection that followed was quickly ended when one of the ringleaders was killed. The log house that had been replaced with a brick structure included a room for storage and a room for sick inmates. 2 more stone rooms to house troublesome inmates were added in 1819. Prison guards were hired from the local population and tasked with keeping prisoners safe, fed, contained, and housed in very close quarters. One of the goals of Connecticut when opening Newgate was for profitably employing the prisoners. Due to the fact that they weren't able to mine copper, nail making was introduced in the early 1800s, and eventually this turned into shoemaking and barrel making. Prisoners unskilled at any trade were put on the man-powered treadmill. Approximately 30 men were required to walk on the rotating steps to grind grain, located inside the 4-story cell block where the treadmill was housed. The prisoners would work from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m., after which they would descend down into the mine to sleep. In the 1820s, the General Assembly of Connecticut became increasingly concerned about overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and the failure of the prison to sustain itself economically. The prison overseers warned that mixing first-time offenders with a gang of the most corrupt, depraved, and incorrigible wretches that have ever disgraced the human form made Newgate a school for crime. Connecticut's criminal code changed in 1821 and significantly increased the number of crimes that were punishable by imprisonment, and it was in this year that the Newgate population swelled to its peak of 127 inmates. At this point, they erected the 4-story cell block to accommodate the increasing population and to combat the inhumane living conditions underground inside the caverns. Officials designed the building to house prisoners and included a granary, storeroom, offices, mess hall, and the treadmill. Once the cell block was completed, men and women could be separated, and the first female prisoner, Rachel Hetty, was admitted. Even after the construction of the new cell block, prison operations still reported that the Newgate was not an efficient state prison. The committee argued for the use of solitary cells, claiming that the cell block housed too many prisoners together, but Newgate's infrastructure was not equipped for solitary confinement. Eventually, this and many other shortcomings led to the prison closing in 1827, and officials transferred 120 inmates to the new state-of-the-art facility in Wethersfield, Connecticut. In the colonial period, it was illegal to smelt ore in the colonies, and mines that operated like here at Newgate were forced to ship their ore all the way to England to be smelted. This made it almost impossible for the mine to be profitable. Even after the prison closed in 1827, a mining company attempted to go back to mining the area, but found that smelting it in place still did not yield enough to make it worthwhile. After attempts at mining it failed, it became a popular tourist destination all the way into the mid-19th century. Since 1968, the state of Connecticut reacquired the site and is operated as a prison museum. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoy the videos and want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon, which supports me directly in my travels and bringing more of these videos to you. Either way, thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, get lost.